Welcome to Philosophy 15, folks. I am Robert Talisse.
I'm Scott Aikin.
We're two philosophy professors engaged in freewheeling, unscripted philosophy conversations, 15 minutes apiece. We're also the authors of several books, including most recently Pragmatism, Pluralism, and the Nature of Philosophy, published with Routledge, and also published with Routledge in its second edition, Why We Argue and How We Should, A Guide to Political Disagreement in an Age of Unreason. For this episode, we thought we'd go all the way back to where introduction to philosophy classes sometimes start, which is with a dialogue of Plato's called the Euthyphro, which contains, at Stephanus page 10a, something called the Euthyphro dilemma, which is still with us today because it looks like it's very obvious and easy and simple to understand, but it's none of those things.
Yeah, and it's fecund too.
Yeah.
So the dilemma arises because Socrates has gotten into this discussion with Euthyphro about the nature of piety. Socrates is being prosecuted for impiety. Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father and has been accused of impiously doing so, and he says those who disagree with him about this have no knowledge of piety and that he wouldn't be the excellent person that he is. Euthyphro would not be better than most men, as he says of himself in the third person, awesome, if he didn't have accurate knowledge of these matters. And so Socrates says, excellent, you know so much about piety, I'm being accused of impiety, can you tell me how this works, what piety is, and then we'll get to the bottom of this. I'll be able to come up with a good defense of myself, and you'll be able to proceed with the prosecution of your father, and this will be great. So tell me what piety is. After a couple rounds, Euthyphro defines piety as what all the gods love. There are a couple other discussions that precede this, but his definition of piety here is what all the gods love. And whereupon Socrates asks the following question. We'll soon know better whether it is what you say it is. Consider this. Is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? This is sometimes called the Euthyphro dilemma. Socrates poses a kind of a challenge to Euthyphro, and he says, look, the things that the gods love, all the gods love, may be coextensive with piety. The question is, what is the explanation for the coextensiveness, right? So we may be able to sort the pious from the impious in terms of what the gods love, but we would like to be able to understand its nature, right? The why of it. The why is it pious? What makes it pious? And so that objective then doesn't just mean that I need to be able to sort piety from impiety correctly. I need to know what piety is, what the is, the essence, the couldn't be otherwise element of piety. And so this regard, Socrates is asking a question not just of definition, but you might say of essence, of nature, of real definition. And the dilemma is that the gods' love is properly responsive to something that is piety, that stands independently of the gods, or that's sometimes called the realist option, and the other option is sometimes called the voluntarist option, which is the gods loving is the thing that makes the pious pious. That in some ways it's by their volition, it's by their desire, by their wanting, by their will, that the reason that the pious is the pious. And so in some ways, these two options are the options that in some ways are orienting questions in ethics and in orienting questions in the ontology of all sorts of evaluative questions. Are we, whenever we make evaluative judgments, responding to properties of the things that those evaluative judgments correctly or incorrectly represent? Or are we in some ways projecting ourselves and our will and our preferences and our desires onto the things?
Right, and notice that any of the popular idiomatic appeals to theology as somehow necessary, or to religion as necessary for providing a ground, a basis for morality, are susceptible to a version of this very question.
That's exactly it.
If you say, well, we should, God commands us not to kill, well, not to murder. say, okay, did God command us to avoid murdering because murder is bad? Or is murder bad because it's one of the things God commands us to not do? And it looks as if the Euthyphro dilemma is not only a dilemma in the formal sense, in that it provides what's presumed to be an exclusive disjunction. We could decide whether that's truly exclusive or not. It's a dilemma in that, in the formal sense, it's an either or, and there's no third option.
Either or, not both.
Right.
Yeah.
Good. But it's also a dilemma in that it looks as if you are somebody who is committed to the idea that theology or religion is necessary to underwrite or ground morality, this question gives you two unattractive positions.
Right.
Because if you say murder is wrong because God forbids it, then
isn't that the end of the story? Come on.
Right. Well, that being the end of the story is the problem. You say, oh, wait a minute, God had no reason to forbid murder?
He's just doing his thing, man.
He flipped a coin, right? It's just capricious. It's just God did something for no sufficient reason. He said, I'm just going to tell him not to murder.
And if you say that, then you have to say it's perfectly possible for him to have said murder good or murder whatever.
Yeah, whatever.
Something else. It's like you must give foot baths or something.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right.
So
that looks like it's unwelcome that God drew up this list of things to do and not to do, but for no reason. He did it arbitrarily or at random. But on the other hand, if you're driven then to say, well, no. God forbids murder because of what murder is. Because murder is forbiddable.
Yeah.
Right?
Murder's got things that God's properly responding to. Look at murder.
Yeah,
right?
Isn't it? Murder is itself bad. Let's leave aside that it's hard. You can't say what murder is without giving it's unjustified killing. But say, okay, well then it looks as if murder has properties that determine its moral status independently then of God's will. And so it looks like you've got a kind of moral realism that God himself is responsive to.
Yeah, it's got to be.
And so then you don't, then God just is a moral advisor, not the source of morality, in which case you don't need theology or religion to underwrite good and bad.
And it's not that it underwrites it, but it could be that he's a good guide. Like he's just really knowledgeable, right? And so you still should trust his judgment, but it's still him just informing you of stuff that he's beholden to also.
That's right. And now remember, we just hit upon one other aspect of this dilemma. So if you go by the realist line, which says that murder is forbidden because of what murder is, murder has properties that recommend to God that he forbid it, then it looks like it's perfectly natural and fine and meaningful to say that God himself is good. On the other horn of the dilemma, though, where there is nothing about murder that recommends that God forbid it, but it's being wrong or forbiddable simply owes to the fact that God in fact disapproves of it, then it looks like it's hard to make sense of the moral evaluation of God.
Yeah.
What does it mean to say God's good?
Perfection is just like God just does what he does. Right? Right. That seems not informative anymore.
That's right. That's right.
So here's one of the challenges of the dilemma. One of them is that once you take the realist option, one of the thoughts is that it looks like it sidelines the divine, at least in terms of, at very best, an advisory role. The commandments are more like reminders or instructive features of moral reality. One of the other features of the realist option is that it's something that, nevertheless, once we start articulating the things that God presumably is responding to whenever he prohibits murder, or when the gods value piety, we are looking at a set of things that we can reason about too. So there's another upshot to the realist option, namely that it makes the things, at least in principle, accessible to our reason too, so that we nevertheless can also reason beyond the God's commandments. So we're no longer beholden to just his commandments. We can see the things that God is responding to in murder and in what have you, and in
adultery or
or something like that. We look at all of those things, and then we can see the pattern that emerges that makes it such that other kinds of things that are bad, that we can use our reason to then see those things and be able to reason on our own to them. And we're no longer beholden to a long, exhaustive list of commandments. We can exercise our own intellectual autonomy to be able to do those sorts of things. So the realism not only has got an explanatory advantage to it, it also has an autonomy element to it also.
Do you think, though, I don't think it would go too far to say. Remember, Scott and I are also authors of a book that we don't have a copy of called Reasonable Atheism. It also then, it looks to me like one implication of the point you just made, Scott, is that the horn of the dilemma that retains the centrality of God to morality is inconsistent with regarding human beings as properly moral agents.
That's right. There is an autonomy problem with the voluntarist conception of God.
Right. We are no longer moral reasoners.
You are beholden, because then the most significant intellectual virtue of a human being is being able to properly interpret God's desires with regards to you.
Right.
That is the primary intellectual virtue of humans, is interpreting God's will. And that is it. Right? And as a consequence, the true, and that's because of the fact that the true moral virtue of humans under those conditions is obedience.
Right.
Which is offensive to anybody who values autonomy and freedom.
With the Bertrand Russell quote that we both love, it's beneath the dignity of a rational creature.
Yeah. So now so we've done a lot of beating up on the voluntarist option.
It's true.
It's because we don't like it. But but in our million sensibilities, there are still things to be said for the voluntarist option. So one of them is one that one of my intellectual heroes, though often considered to be a villain of the Western philosophical tradition, René Descartes, is somebody who took the voluntarist option, and somebody who really reasoned quite well with regards to it. So here's Descartes' defense of voluntarism. 1. God's primary defining feature is his will. God is primarily a willing thing, and his power, God's power, is his primary feature. So notice that whenever you say that there were a bunch of things that he could have done otherwise, what God is actually doing is actually creating the possibilities by making actualities. So by saying it was an arbitrary choice requires that there be antecedent possibles, is what's sometimes called the doctrine of antecedent possibles. But it's not arbitrary. God's choosing is actually the thing that makes all those contraries possible. There was no definitive thing at all before he made these decisions. So as a consequence, all of the arguments from arbitrariness are ones that actually come well after the fact, and ones that are actually created by an illusion of our own minds. That's the Cartesian response. Second one. Notice, by the way, that the voluntarist option, beyond the theological programs, are ones that actually are able to capture a number of the features of the development of the development of our moral concepts. That our moral concepts, in some ways, are manifestations of our will. Why? Because in some ways, what they do is they represent the things that we want the best. And so whenever we call these things and are representing things, what we're doing is we're representing our desires for worlds that we feel like we're going to be better in. And as a consequence, the nice thing about voluntarism is that given the other possibles that come after our decisions, we can actually articulate what moral change ultimately is.
But isn't it possible for us, let's forget about the question about the relation of the theology.
Yeah.
Isn't it possible to say that with respect to a certain class of value, the voluntarist story is perfectly appropriate? That, the value of my spouse is in fact the product of my attachment to her. Right. You can say the Harry Frankfurt stuff about a certain range of value.
That's right. Why do I love this person? And you say, well, the loving seemed to just show up, man, and then all of the other things that I'm responding to then happened after the loving.
And it's a kind of distortion. It's a distortion of loving to try to think of it in terms of a response to a property.
That's exactly because that would then say everybody else should be in love with my spouse,
good.
And I would love any spouse, and I would love any other person that exhibited these properties too. Good.
So it looks like it's the right story for us about certain kinds of things that are valuable.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that and I take it that we should also reserve.
We'll finish the thought. Let's do this.
Let's finish the thought. It looks like, certain kinds of sites of value are best given a voluntarist interpretation. Got it. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be and couldn't. Certainly doesn't mean we couldn't be. It doesn't mean we shouldn't be either realists about other kinds of value.
So now the question is, how do we demarcate the two?
Good.
Good.
That is the question.
Ding, 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 ding.